Hey everybody, I keep saying that I'm gonna wrap up each month of this year that I've read so far, that I've skipped, and now we're in November and I still haven't done it. So I'm adding October to the list. But I hope to rapid fire these wrap ups and hopefully we can get through the rest of this year together. And this first reading wrap up is for June 2024. I read three books from front to back and DNF'd one. Unfortunately, that DNF was Mayflies by Andrew O'Hagan. I was so looking forward to this book. I wanted to read it back in May, and, we could just say that because I timed it wrong and I ended up reading it in June instead, or attempting to read it in June, that's why I DNF'd. It just wasn't the right timing. This isn't a bad book. I do believe that people who read the plot summary, read the blurbs, gather more information about what they're getting into with this book, I do feel like a good portion of people will enjoy it. Unfortunately, the reason why I couldn't is because this is a story about teenage boy friendship, which was what drew me to the book in the first place. I believe that this friendship carries on into the future in some way. I didn't get to that point. I only made it a few chapters in to where there was a concert coming up. But with this group of friends, I never felt like I was part of their friend group. I always felt like an outsider, like their jokes were all inside jokes and I could never fully understand it. I'm a lonely person. I like to find friends in fiction, and I just couldn't befriend these guys. I wasn't a part of their club. So that's why I ultimately DNF'd. It wasn't an offensive book. It wasn't horribly written. It was just that I felt like an outsider, and that was disappointing to me. So, one of the books that I read from front to back was Several People Are Typing by Calvin Kasulki. I gave this book 3 stars. This book was gearing up to be a 5-star book because so much of it was relatable to me. These characters live on Slack. In fact, one character, Gerald, lives inside Slack. That's one of the plot points. His productivity is up. People are wondering how. How? I don't know when exactly this book was written. I don't know if it was pre-pandemic or post-pandemic, because I do feel like a lot of companies kind of adopted the work from home mindset afterwards. But before, working from home was kind of this gray area where if you send people home, what are they actually going to do at home if you can't keep an eye on them? And in this book, Gerald breaks that idea. Everybody wants to know why, including his managers, and he just wants to get out of Slack. Like, he just wants to escape. And of course, all of his coworkers around him on Slack had their own side conversations that are also very relatable. It's just these really funny, specific events that happen in this book that made me laugh out loud. Unfortunately, there was a scene that happened toward the end of the book that I did not appreciate at all. It was actually one of my biggest literary pet peeves that happened in a chapter later on. I don't want to spoil it, but I almost feel like I have to. So I may decide to just do a full review of this book from front to back that contains spoilers, because I don't usually include spoilers in my wrap-ups. So if that's interesting to you, then by all means, let me know in the comments. But it was something that caused this book to drop 2 stars, and had this scene happened earlier in the book, I would have DNF'd. Another book that I read from front to back, this is technically on paper my highest rated book, but I think that the book after this had some exceptional qualities that bumps it ahead. So I'm going to talk about Tough by Terry Crews first. This is his memoir. I loved how this book was split up. So this wasn't a linear front to back from childhood to adulthood sort of story. He broke his memoir up into different elements where he spoke about how those elements affected his childhood to adulthood in each section. I found that organization to be unique from a lot of the memoirs that I've read, and it helped me keep track of each theme a bit better. And he covered so many themes in this book. Not all of them were necessarily broken up, but he did talk about domestic abuse. He talked about religion, which is one of the topics that I appreciated. Some of his thoughts and ideas around religion and church were ones that I reflect. He talked about racism. He talked about colorism. He more or less broke what it means to be a man in this memoir, and he was able to be vulnerable and talk about his masculinity in a way that I don't think a lot of men really talk about it that way. There were a few topics that I refused to touch. Some of them were a little too hot for me. The way that he defined abuse, the way that he carried some of these bad habits and had to unlearn them himself as an adult. These are the things that I pick out. Like, yes, some of his topics, like I said, were hot, but those weren't necessarily the ones that I latched onto as much. Therefore, I was able to give it 5 stars and not really complain about it. The top book that I read from front to back in June is one that I have recommended to everybody under the sun. Therefore, I am recommending it to you. The Radium Girls by Kate Moore. This is nonfiction. This is something that I knew enough about to pick up the book, but reading this and learning more about what these women went through was frustrating. It made me angry. I don't know if I've ever pulled for a group of people as much as I did these women who worked in this, I almost said factory, but I think it was even described as a studio, where they painted these watch dials with radioactive paint. Back in the 1920s, I believe, radium was a hot commodity. The world was raving about radium. They were saying that it would give you superhuman strength. All the rich people were going after it. They would put it in water and drink it. And so these women, these young women, like 20s, somewhere in their teens, I think, they were excited to work at this studio to paint these dials for soldiers so that they can tell the time at night without giving away their locations to the enemy. They were excited about painting these watches using this really cool new paint, this radium, this new element, and also be paid well. I think this was one of the highest paying jobs for women at the time. So of course they were stoked. They were super happy. They would use this radium paint. Sometimes the flakes would get on their clothes and they realized that they glowed in the dark. So then when they were going to go out and party after work, they would paint their faces with it. They would intentionally wear their best clothes to work so that when the paint flakes would cling to them, they would look good when they would glow literally when they would go out. So yeah, they had a great time until things started going wrong. Radium is radioactive. It is not meant to be ingested in any way, and one of the things that they were doing, besides breathing in the dust that was in the air from I imagine dry radium paint, they would put the tips of the paintbrushes in their mouth to create a point. If anybody is listening and you've ever painted, you know that paintbrushes tend to fray. So to prevent that, that's what they did to make their tips fine enough to paint these really tiny, precise dials on these watches. There's a lot of gaslighting in this book from a company who claimed that nothing was wrong. Because again, like I said, back in that time, radium was just this hot thing, this hot stuff that everybody wanted to get their hands on. So yeah, you're going to be frustrated. You're going to be angry reading about this, but oh my gosh. If you know anything about the history of this, about radium dial, about these women who fought for their rights back in the early 1920s, this spanned decades. I would still definitely recommend reading this book to get a little bit more of an intimate perspective on some of the individuals who had to go through this. I listened to the audiobook and it kept me on the edge of my seat. I can see it being a bit slow for some people, but for me, just waiting for that next point was so important because, like I said, I've never wanted to get to a resolution more, in a good way, because, like I said, frustration, anger, all of it. Just read this book. It will teach you something maybe you didn't know about American history. And I think it's definitely something, especially if you're looking into women's rights or workers' rights, then this would certainly be a good nonfiction book for you. I think I've talked enough about this. So if that has encouraged you to check out this book or any of the books that I've mentioned today, their Goodreads links are in the description below. Click on those. Head on over to the retailer of your choice and purchase them if you're feeling brave, or check them out at your local library or use your library app if they are available. If you enjoyed this video for whatever reason, do please leave a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Otherwise, I've been Jim. You've been great. Happy reading.